I'm afraid you don't. You have to go on YouTube if you want any more of that.
You have to sign in. So you spent all this time in publishing, but you're a vicar. What happened?
Yes, it was just there wasn't a lightning bolt moment, but I was working, so I'd been a year or so at Virgin Books, and I was getting to a sort of more senior place, and many of you, if you've been in a job for a long time, you'll know that there's a point where you can see the road ahead, you can see what it looks like. And I would have been running a list, I'd been publishing director somewhere for my next job probably, and I'd always been really fired up and really excited about my work, and I just wasn't about this, and I just couldn't figure out why, and I talked to God about it and was just asking him. And at the same time, I had friends at my church saying, you should really think about ordination. And I laughed in their face when they first mentioned it, and just thought that was ridiculous. But I realised that what I needed to do was to take a step out and to take some time out and go and work for a church or work for a Christian organisation. And I didn't know what to do. So I had dinner with one of the ministers at my church, and he said, oh, come and work for us. We'll sort you out with a job. They had a staff of about 19, so it wasn't too difficult to... so they had people leaving, so they sandwiched me a job together. So I did 50% music minister, and then the rest I was part-time helping the youth team and part-time doing some men's work. And really, I'd been there about 3 weeks when I knew I wasn't going to go back to publishing, because I realised that when I worked in an office, I always felt terribly naughty, because I loved just going around and finding out how people were doing. If I had a quiet afternoon, I'd just go around and talk to people. Now that's not productive, is it? It's not. You're not making anyone any money, and you're not doing your work. But when I got into ministry, I realised that actually that is the job. Going around and finding out how people are doing, and just being alongside them is pretty much what we do. And so I realised actually no, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. At that point I thought, well, if I'm supposed to be doing this, then maybe I am supposed to be ordained. So I filled in the ridiculous form that you have to do for the bishop, and took it from there. And it took about 9 months, and it was fairly straightforward. So yes, found myself at theological college.
And did you have a wife by this stage?
I didn't, no. I had a girlfriend, so I'd met the lovely Eileen at my church. I always say, she said, don't tell them that our eyes met across a crowded church, because it's not true, but our eyes did meet across a crowded church. She's not here to correct me. She'll probably listen back to this and shout at me. But yeah, we were there was a big bunch of 20 and 30-somethings at my church, so we knew a lot of people in common before we knew each other, and there was this strange thing where we weren't both in the same place at the same time to actually start going out, and eventually we did start going out. And I'd come off the back, I'd been going out with a girl for 9 or 10 months, and it just hadn't really been right. And I think when you come out of something like that, I knew what I didn't want from a relationship, and I knew what I did want. And as soon as I was together with Eileen, I was like, yeah, this is the one. So we got engaged just after I started at Oak Hill, started my theology. She was living in Muswell Hill, which was handy, so I was only up in Southgate, so it was very near. So yes, we got engaged. We were planning our wedding, which was going to happen the next summer. And then life started to get rather complicated, because my dad had had a lot of ill health. So he'd had to retire just because he wasn't well enough to work. Some years earlier, there's a very long story where his kidneys stopped tolerating the lithium that he was on. Lithium is a very slow release and builds up in your system. And if your kidneys aren't working, it builds up in your system and goes uncontrolled. And he went into a coma. And then, while he was still I can't remember the order of things, but he recovered from that. And the hospital wouldn't tell us what was going on, really. But And they didn't know. They actually, and what doctors don't like to say is we don't know. They really don't like to say that. But I got a lovely letter a few months afterwards saying your father's case was so unusual that we've written a paper on it, which is now helping other doctors. I was like, I'm so pleased for you that my dad went into a coma and we thought he was going to die, and it's been really helpful for other people. And so that makes me sound very small, doesn't it? But the level of information was so small. Anyway, so my dad has had a lot of ill health. He was diabetic, and if you know any diabetics who have any mental illness issues, you'll know it's not a good combination. So he ended up losing a leg. He was in hospital for 6 months, and really he never recovered from that. They had him made. They had a prosthetic leg made, but he never walked again because he just didn't have it in him. And I remember I had a call, when I heard that his physio had given up on him, I rang the physio, a fantastic woman, and spoke to her. I was on the phone to her for about an hour and a half. I just wanted to know what had happened. And by the end of it, I was like, no, this woman, if you know physios, they're very determined. She had been very determined, and she was heartbroken that she hadn't been able to make the difference. So anyway, my dad stayed in bed basically from then on, and he was a difficult patient. He wasn't the easiest guy at the best of times. And yeah, my mum looked after him, and my mum wasn't, found that quite difficult to be a carer. Then he had a stroke. So the Christmas that we had just got engaged, my dad had this massive stroke. We had been sort of trying to figure out, well, could we get him to the wedding in a wheelchair and stuff? Then bang, in one go, we were left with, about 3 weeks after the stroke, we had the talk with the doctors where they basically said he's not going to get any better. He couldn't speak, he couldn't move, he was just in bed. And I was trying to go and see him as much as I could, but I couldn't really manage it after a while because it was just so draining to go and see him. My mum went every day, and I've still no idea how she managed to do that. So we knew he wasn't going to last. And they said, well, you could go on for years, or you could just, go on for a few weeks, and we just don't know. And I looked at my mum, and we talked in the car on the way home and said, I don't think he's got years. I think he's maybe got months. And sure enough, he died 2 months later, so beginning of March. So yes, we managed that, and so we're thinking, well, okay, we'll go ahead, we'll get married, it's going to be a sad day. And then so it came to June, and we'd finished term, and I got a call from my brother on a Sunday lunchtime. I was having lunch with Eileen at her flat, and we had a call, and my brother rang me and just said, do you know where Mum is? And I said, well, no. She was an hour late for lunch with my brother, and that never happened. She would never be late. So I said, well, look, let me get on the phone, because someone's probably seen her at church, or they might not have done, and that'll tell us something. So I rang a friend from church and she said, oh no, well, she wasn't at church this morning. And actually, come to think of it, she didn't turn up for helping with something on Friday. So by this time, I'm like, okay, what's going on? So they said, well, look, we're just going out. Would you like us to call around the house and see? So 10 minutes later, the phone rang and said, Mark, your mum's house, the curtains are shut and the car's outside. So at this point, they said, do you want us to stay around? I said, yes, please. I pegged it in my little Mini back up to Oak Hill and got my keys. And Eileen and I went in and found that my mum had died 2 days earlier at home. It was a very hot summer. And she knew she had heart problems. Now, my mum had had a huge amount of surgery in her life. She'd had, among other things, she'd had 2 new knees, she'd had a new shoulder, she'd had breast cancer, she'd had something removed from her nose, she'd been on kidney dialysis for 8 years of her life, and then she had a kidney transplant. So my mum did not want more surgery in her life, but she knew that she had this heart valve problem. She hadn't told me, she told my brother. So she needed major surgery. And yes, just had a massive heart attack and died. And that was 13 days before we were due to get married. that Eileen and I walked in on her. So, yes, that was a tough time. But we decided, we woke up the next day, and I'd stayed on the couch at Eileen's, and we sort of looked, it had been the elephant in the room the previous day. It's like, will we still do this? What do we do? And I looked at her, and we said, well, or I said, well, I don't memorize. I don't have a lot of verses that I remember in the Bible, but I do know Genesis 2:24, which says a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they'll be one flesh. And I was like, well, my mum and dad have left me, not really of their own volition, but I don't feel like if I put this off, then I'm a sort of wandering nomad in an emotional no man's land. And what I need is to be married and have my wife and be together. And that's a hard thing to say. It was hard to do. It was very hard for my family. But we managed it. And a very fantastic minister, very good friend of mine who married us, we spent 3 hours with him the week before where he talked about, what are we going to do here? How are we going to do this so that it's a happy day, but it's also a sad day? And yeah, it's funny. People say all sorts of strange things about death, don't they? So people say, oh, it wasn't very considerate to die then, was it? I've heard from people about both my parents. I sort of think, well, I'm not sure they were thinking about it, really. I think death sort of just came round. Wasn't the timing terrible? It's like, well, I'd love to know when would be a good time for someone you're really close to die suddenly. And I got asked when I was finishing when I finished my finals at Oak Hill, they do an interview. I hope they still do this, where they sit you down and important people from the Church of England sort of ask you to make sure you're actually still suitable, because they saw you a few years ago. And they said, that must have really tested your faith. And I said, and I really believe this, it did on some levels. But I said, well, if you show me somebody who's got a faith that can't withstand the death of people they're close to in their life, possibly at quite inconvenient moments, then they're probably not going to get very far in life, because that is just stuff we have to deal with. But yes, I have an ongoing conversation with God about timing, certainly.
Okay. And the next piece of music
may be
connected with that.
No, the next song that I found what happened to me with God, and it's helped me to articulate it to other people who are mourning, is that you find anything very hard to say. So I couldn't string a sentence together in prayer, but I did have the Psalms open in front of me. And I just found listening to a lot of Christian music was very helpful. And this song in particular, just because it says, it's a Tim Hughes song called I've Had Questions, where, it's just saying, I don't know, but I know that God knows, and I'm going to just keep my faith in God, and I'm going to keep praising God, even when life sucks and is horrible, because I think that's what I'm supposed to do.